Good day, everyone. Good day to you, ma'am. Today, I am going to report the chapter 3 entitled Law and Obligations in Contracts of this subject, Legal Aspects in Tourism and Hospitality. So, let's start. The ethical basis of business is integrity, an ethical aspect that unites both private morality and public and professional ethics. Business ethics refers to the standards for morally right and wrong conduct in business. Law partially defines the conduct, but legal and ethical aren't necessarily the same. Business ethics enhances the law by outlining acceptable behaviors beyond government control. And here are our learning objectives. First is to identify the different kinds of obligations and contracts. Second, to enumerate the ways of extinguishing an obligations. And third, enumerate possible applications of contracts in the tourism, travel, and hospitality industry. And here is the topic contents or the topic overview. First is the elements of obligations, the obligations of the passive subject, the classifications of obligations, the modes of extinguishing obligations, and the elements, characteristics, and classifications of contracts. So let us define what is obligations. In Article 1156, an obligation is a juridical necessity to give, to do, or not to do. An obligation is a legal duty, however created, the violation of which may become the basis of an action of the law. Obligation is the requirement to do what is imposed by law, promise, or contract. Obligation is synonymous with duty, and it is a tie which binds us to pay or to do something agreeably to the laws and customs of the country. According to Arias Ramos, obligation is nothing more than the duty of a person or which the debtor or the obligor to satisfy a specific and demandable claim of another person, which is the creditor or the obligee, which, if breached, is enforced in court. Next, we have the elements of obligation. First element of obligations is the active subject or the creditor or obligee. He is the person who has the right to demand the fulfillment of the obligation. Second element of obligations is the passive subject or the debtor or obligor. He is the one who is bound to the fulfillment of the obligation. And third element is the prestation or the object. It may consist in giving, doing, or not doing. Without prestation, there is nothing to perform. Object refers to the property or the things. Prestation is the subject matter of the obligation. And the fourth one is the efficient cause, or in other words, the juridical or legal tie, that which binds or connects the parties to the obligation. The tie is an obligation that can easily determined by knowing the source of the obligation. Next, the following are the obligations of the passive subject. In first, obligations to give a determinate thing. Here, he is the one to deliver the thing which he has obligated himself to give, to take care of the thing with the proper diligence of a good father of a family, and to deliver all its accessories and accessions. And lastly is to pay damages in case of breach of obligation. A next obligation is the obligations to do. If the debtor fails to do what he is obliged to do, it will be done at his expense. If the work is done in contravention of the tenor of the obligation, it will be redone at debtor's expense. And if the work is poorly done, it will be redone at debtor's expense. And next, we have the sources of liability of a party in an obligation are as follows: the fraud, the negligence, delay, and the contravention of the tenor of the obligation. First, let's tackle the fraud. The fraud is incidental fraud, which is fraud incident to the performance of an obligation. In fraud, there is an intent to evade the normal fulfillment of the obligation and to cause damage. Second is the negligence. The negligence referred here in the case of contracts is culpa contractual, the lack of diligence or carelessness. Negligence consists in the omission of that diligence which is required by the nature of the obligation and corresponds with the circumstances of the persons or the time and of the place. Third is delay. The debtor can be held liable for the delay or default in the fulfillment of his obligation only after the creditor has made a demand, judicial or extrajudicial, on the debtor except when the law expressly provides that demand is not necessary, when the contract expressly stipulates that demand is not necessary, when time is of the essence, and when the demand would be useless. And fourth is the contravention of the tenor of the obligation. Performance in contravention of the tenor or terms of the obligations means where performance is contrary to what is agreed upon or stipulated, thus making the debtor liable for damages. Next, we have the law in Article 1157. Obligations arise from the five. First is the law, then contracts, then quasi contracts, then fourth is the acts or omissions punishable by law, and lastly, the quasi delicts. In Article 1158, obligations derived from law are not presumed. Only those expressly determined in this code or in special laws are demandable and shall be regulated by the precepts of the law which establishes them and as to what has not been foreseen by the provisions of this book. Obligations arising from contracts according to Article 1159 have the force of law between the contracting parties and should be complied with in good faith. Article 1160 stated that obligations derived from quasi-contracts shall be subject to the provisions of Chapter 1, Title, Title 17 of the book. And in Article 1161, civil obligations arising from criminal offenses shall be governed by the penal laws, subject to the provisions of Article 2177 and of the pertinent provisions of Chapter 2, preliminary title on human relations, and of Titles 18 of this book regulating damages. And in Article 1162, obligations derived from quasi-delicts shall be governed by the provisions of Chapter 2, Title 17 of this book and by special laws. And next, here are the classifications of obligations. First is the primary classification of obligations under the Civil Code are the pure and conditional obligations in Article 1179 to 1192. Second, obligations with a period. Third, alternative and facultative obligations. Next is the joint and solidary obligations. And we have also the divisible and indivisible obligations. And lastly, the obligations with a penal clause. A pure obligation is one which is not subject to any condition and no specific date is mentioned for its fulfillment and is therefore immediately demandable. Example of pure obligation uh, example situation is Pat promises to pay Joy 1,000 pesos. There is no specific time and conditions being said, so it is pure obligations. And A conditional obligation is one which consequence are subject in one way or another to the fulfillment of a condition. Example: Carol promises to pay 1,000 if Darren remains to become an outstanding employee of the hotel for the month of May. And next, an obligation with a period is one which consequence are subject in one way or another to the expiration of the said period or term. Example: Alfredo, which is the owner of the hotel, promises to pay Brittany, which is an employee of the hotel, a 5,000 pesos on or before December 30, 2024 as part of the staff incentive program. So, it is an obligation with a period as it has a required deadline for him to pay his obligations. And joint obligations are those where, although there concord two or more creditors and debtors in one and the same obligation, there is no right to demand nor a duty on the part of each of the latter to render entire compliance for the entire obligation. And solidary obligations are those in which concur several debtors or creditors, or both, and where each creditor has the right to demand and each debtor is bound to perform in its entirely the prestation constituting the object of the obligation. And secondary classifications of obligations under the Civil Code are the unilateral and bilateral obligations, the real and personal obligations, and the civil and natural obligations, and lastly, the legal, conventional, and penal obligations. And here we have also the modes of extinguishing obligations. In Article 1231, obligations are extinguished by payment or performance, by the loss of the thing due, by the condonation or remission of the debt, and fourth, by the confusion or merger of the rights of creditor or debtor. Fifth is by compensation, and lastly is by novation. Next, let's tackle the article about contracts. In Article 1305, a contract is a meeting of minds between two persons whereby one binds himself with respect to the other to give something or to render some service. The essential elements of a contract are as follows. First is consent, which is manifested by the meeting of the minds of the offer and the acceptance upon the thing and the cost which are to constitute the contract. The offer must be certain and the acceptance is absolute. Next is the object certain, which is the subject matter of the contract, and the third is the cause of the obligation which is established. And we have the characteristics of a contract. The first characteristics of a contract is the mutuality of contracts. Its validity and performance cannot be left to the will of the only one of the parties. Second characteristics of contracts is the autonomy of contracts. Autonomy of contracts are parties are free to stipulate terms and provisions in a contract as long as these terms and provisions are not contrary order and public policy, to law, morals, good customs, and public. Next characteristics of contracts is the relativity of contracts. Contracts are binding only upon the parties and their successors in interest. Exception is stipulation in favor of a third person, as in a beneficiary of an insurance policy. Fourth is the consensuality of contracts. It is a contracts are perfected by mere consent, and no form is prescribed by law for their validity. And the exception is real contracts, such as pledge, chattel mortgage, and contracts must be covered under the statute of frauds. And next characteristics is obligatory force of contracts. By the obligatory force of contracts, it constitutes the law as between the parties who are compelled to perform under the threat of being sued in the courts of law.